Welcome to the Quincy Institute's book talk on Amitav Acharya's book, The Once and Future World Order. My name is Trita Parsi. I'm the Executive Vice President of the Quincy Institute, a Washington think tank that promotes ideas that move U.S. foreign policy away from endless war and toward rigorous diplomacy. We favor a national security strategy that is centered on diplomacy and military restraint. Spanning 5 millennia, from ancient Sumer, Persia, and India to medieval caliphates and Eurasian empires, Amitav Acharya demonstrates that world order long predates the modern West. Humanitarian norms, economic interdependence, and rules of interstate conduct emerge across civilizations, suggesting that order can endure and perhaps even improve as power diffuses away from Washington and Brussels. Far from a prelude to disorder, the decline of Western primacy may open up space for a more plural and equitable system. Acharya provocatively asks, what if the end of Western domination is not a disaster, but rather a chance to build a fairer global system? And that goes to the core question of whether history has examples, good examples in which order emerged out of non-hegemonic systems. And this is what we will be focusing on today. For those of you who are joining us via Zoom, you can use the Q&A function to ask questions. I will try to get to those throughout our conversations. If you are watching this on Twitter, on Facebook, or on other platforms, you can also ask your questions by putting in your comments, and we will try to get to them as well. So with no further ado, allow me to introduce Amitav Acharya more properly. Professor Acharya stands as one of the most visionary and influential voices in contemporary international relations. He is the UNESCO Chair and Distinguished Professor at the American University in Washington. Previously, he was professor at York University, University of Toronto, and the University of Bristol in the UK. He has authored over 20 books and more than 200 articles shaping critical debates in areas like regionalism, human security, and global order. A pioneer of global IR, Acharya challenges the dominance of traditional Western theories by highlighting non-Western perspectives and the dynamic pluralism of our international system. Welcome to our conversation, Professor. It's a great pleasure to have you here with us. You are on mute.
Okay.
There you are. I can hear you now.
Thank you very much, Mr. Parsi, and greetings. Thank you very much for letting me have the opportunity to share my thoughts in the book. And you have already given a nice little summary of the book. And if you indulge me, allow me, I can give you a 2-minute overview of my main argument.
Please do. Please tell us not only the core thesis and the argument that you're advancing, but tell us also why you chose to write this book at this moment.
All right. So the key argument of the book, really the main argument of the book for an audience that is more interested in the present and the future, and with a relevance for policy community, is this, that the decline of Western dominance is not a catastrophe. In fact, it can benefit the larger majority of humankind, and by opening up new possibilities of cooperation, conflict management, and development, and also even moral behavior. Now, why do I say that? There are 2 reasons for it. The first reason is that the period of Western dominance, so maybe the last 300 years, let's put it roughly, has not been benign or good for the non-West, the vast majority of humankind who don't live in the West. Despite claims about the benign contribution of the West to human civilization progress, some of it is true, but it's not the contribution of the West has been also some dark sides and has not been as benign as it claimed to be. And that's because we have histories of, first of all, going a little back before World War II, but even to some extent today, the colonialism and racism and the legacies they live on. I mean, in the West throughout the world, but even in the United States today, racism continues to have the legacy of racism, legacy of slavery continues. But I'm talking about, if we look at the other countries in the world, the same thing. The legacy of imperialism and colonialism had a profound effect on many non-Western societies. And you can't say that they have benefited. And another related point is that if you look at the wars of the recent years, I know Quincy Institute particularly focuses on wars, and there you see that in the so-called liberal international order after 1945 that was dominated by the US, more than 97% of the conflicts happened in what we call the global South. And the West escaped those wars, especially Europe. Now, of course, we have war in Ukraine, but during the most of the Cold War, the global South suffered most of the death, destruction, and ravages of war intervention, some of them fueled by Western intervention. And also in development, there has been, of course, much progress in economic development, but again, it has disproportionately benefited the Western countries. If you take a 300-year history, and even when it has benefited some global South countries, there has been a lot of inequality and the like. So my main point here is that the world order the last 300 years has not been very good for the non-Western countries or peoples, which are the majority, who are the majority of humankind. The second reason is that why the decline of Western dominance need not be catastrophic, but may open up possibilities, is that a world order is not the monopoly of the West. Creating pathways for peace, progress, development, and democracy has come from multiple civilizations. And in some ways, much of the empirical section of this empirical parts of this 5,000 years history has it's about that. And I can give you examples of the idea of independence of state. The states, what we call sovereignty today, but the basic idea that states will be independent, it's not a Western creation. The idea that the idea about diplomacy to solve conflicts, peace treaties, they were created or invented actually in the ancient Near East around the middle of the second millennium BC. Great power cooperation also came from that region. We go back to also that period of second millennium BC in the ancient Near East. You look at humanitarian norms like protecting people in war and leaving civilians out of conflict and helping the soldiers and combatants that are wounded who have surrendered. These are very clear norms about this in ancient India and to some extent ancient China. So I can give you many examples. Freedom of seas, a big issue behind economic interdependence and free trade, was actually developed in the Indian Ocean without the support of any hegemonic power. It was developed and managed by small port city states for about 1,000 years before the arrival of the Western colonial powers in the Indian Ocean. And rational mode of thinking, the idea that we can have scientific rational thinking, moving away from creationism, that God created everything. Actually, some of that came from Greek civilization, some of that came from the Indian civilization, some of them most strikingly came from Islam around the time of before the Renaissance. So what I'm trying to say is that if we add this all together, world order is not the monopoly. The institutions, ideas, norms of world order, it's not the monopoly of the West. The West has actually benefited from some of these prior contributions. And this has continued after World War II. Although we give credit to United States and Western countries for developing the post-World World Order, actually there are a lot of contributions from the global South countries, and they also help to strengthen and develop and strengthen norms of anti-colonialism, human rights, women's rights, and economic development that we have in the UN system, in the global governance system today.
Thank you so much, Amitav. And you give excellent examples. I want to go into some of them a bit more deeper. But I also want to make a distinction. It's one thing, of course, to point out that so many of these different norms and institutions and practices of diplomacy, as you pointed out, protection of civilians, norms around the use of force, come from much more ancient civilizations. These were not all invented in any way, shape, or form by the West, although, of course, it's actually very valuable for you to write this book since this is not fully recognized and known. But that is nevertheless different from actual ordering. So when you talk about orders in these ancient systems, particularly the ones that were not hegemonic, what mechanisms did they rely upon in order to sustain order in the absence of a hegemon? Because we are now in a moment in which there is plenty of anxiety, not just in the United States, but in the West. And a belief, perhaps not entirely accurate, that in the absence of not just a Western, but specifically an American hegemonic role, the world will move dramatically towards chaos. And that is rooted in history. That is the argument. You're making a completely different counter argument. What are the mechanisms and the examples that show that even in the absence of hegemony, there actually were sustainable orders that were created outside of the West?
One of the arguments I make one of the arguments I make in the book is that some of the mechanisms have not really changed. They have become a different, maybe a little more developed, a little bit institutionalized. For example, in 1259 BC, Egypt and Hatti, the two superpowers of the ancient Near East, signed a peace treaty. It's called Treaty of Kadesh. And it provided for non-aggression, that you should not encroach on each other's territory. It provided for non-intervention, alliances against common threats, and also understanding and communication among the two powers to preserve the peace. So to some extent, that's basically what we have in the United Nations system. In other cases, you have norms that are actually more developed than today. So the norms of what you call just war, that don't harm civilians, non-combatants, wounded soldiers, was actually observed, both codified and observed in ancient India around 3rd century BC. And they are actually, to some extent, more advanced than Geneva Conventions. And it's described in a book, not using poisonous weapons, for example, in war. It was codified. Not because Indians were peaceful people necessarily, but they wanted these norms to limit the scope of violence and make the wars more just and more humane. So humanitarian norms. And if you look at other things, like for some norms were there in very early foundational forms. Maybe you can say that the right to property, right to life, they existed in West Africa. They existed at the same time. They're proclaimed in Magna Carta. They're not very well developed, what we call human rights today, but they were foundational. Or democracy, the idea of republicanism. But they became more developed later. But that doesn't mean we should not acknowledge them. And let me give you one example. Origins of democracy. We give credit to Athens, ancient Athens, for inventing democracy. But as we know, Athenian democracy is nothing like what we have today. So voting was very limited to citizens and to male citizens who served in the military. But more importantly, Athenian democracy did not have individual liberty. I want to emphasize individual liberty. The liberty in Athens was liberty of the state or polis. And that's basically the liberty of Athens versus Sparta. And other city-states had sent Sparta versus Athens, or Sparta and Athens versus Persia. So this was the liberty of the state, liberty of the polis. And individual liberty could be easily sacrificed when the leaders of the city-states felt that they are being threatened by an outside force. But we today, just think of democracy in whether United States or India or Japan without civil liberties. We cannot think of democracy without civil liberties, but we still give credit to Athens, and I have no problems with that. But why don't we just do the same thing for ancient India, who developed just war principles, or ancient China, who also developed the system of what I call having a kind of a more benign governance system under Confucianism without necessarily colonizing other countries? Or why don't we give credit to ancient Egyptians and ancient Sumerians for developing principles that are not like what we have today, but they are foundational. We do that for Greece. We do that for Rome. Rome had a republic, but there are many republics in the world around that time. And we only think Roman Republic is the model for Americans, our US Constitution. But there are other republics in India. I mean, there were also republics in Maya city-states. So we have a double standard here. When it comes from Greece and Rome, which, by the way, did not identify themselves as European, they were Mediterranean civilization. But we give them credit for imperfect, rudimentary ideas and institutions that became developed only in the 19th and 20th century, like democracy and human rights. But we don't do the same thing for other civilizations. And that's a double standard here.
It's a very valid point, and you give a plethora of examples of various ideas that originated from outside of the West, outside of the Mediterranean as well, and credit is not given for it. But I want to go a little bit deeper onto a different issue here. Clearly, many different ideas that have helped shape Western civilization and Western ideas of order come from outside of the West, and it's built upon thousands of years of experience and learning. But when it comes to the core issue of whether a multiplex or a multipolar world can be stable without what we have in the last century, essentially either a bipolar system or a unipolar system, a lot of the anxiety is not just coming from the idea that absent the West, because of Western values, the order will be crumbling, but also absent a hegemonic power. So I think these are two different questions. On the one hand, the racism that I think you correctly point to, which thinks that only the West can actually create an order that is acceptable, that is liberal, that is all of these different things. And you show that many of these ingredients come from elsewhere. But what about the other issue, though, which is really on the minds of most people here in Washington, and I think in other places, which is just a focus on the distribution of power and whether stability can be sustained in the absence of a hegemonic power. What does history and your examples from outside the West teach us of how in these type of multiplex or multipolar systems, you point out that they are actually the norm rather than a unipolar or a bipolar system, how they work? Even the example that you gave is more of a bipolar system between the Egyptians and the Hittites back in 1200 BC. But in what we are going towards now, you point out yourself, a multiplex. What will be the mechanisms of stability that will make that system better than what we've had?
Okay, thank you. That's a great question. So let me start by saying that the idea of hegemony is a very imprecise, much abused term. For one thing, there was never really true global hegemony. Hegemony has always been regional, not global. So you can say that Britain and the United States have global hegemony, but really the British did not have influence over continental Europe because of the balance of power system. And the United States, although it's the #1 power after World War II, but did not really have same influence all over the world. It had more influence in East Asia and maybe the Middle East than other parts of the world. A lot of countries in the world were non-aligned. The Soviet Union and China was not under American influence. So being the most powerful country and being a hegemon are two different things, where hegemony implies that people actually voluntarily, in some ways, accept your dominance and your dominance is legitimized. But beyond that, the Roman Empire, the Han Empire, the Maurya Empire, Ottoman Empire, they were not global hegemons. So hegemony has never really been global. That's one of the key things about my book. So how did world order then emerge? It emerged from different regions developing sometimes different, but sometimes similar institutions. And that's one of the key arguments of the book, that world order is a shared creation, doesn't mean everything is same. But similar institutions and ideas evolved, whether they are independence of states or rules of humanitarian norms, not from every civilization, but from different civilizations. But actually, they did emerge. So, for example, the Andean civilization of Peru, which is one of the three earliest civilizations in the world, they had norms of reciprocity. How do you manage, reciprocate with each other and therefore manage stability? And they didn't learn from anybody because they were kind of separated. The Iroquois, the Confederacy in North America, which is straddles Canada and New York, other parts of the world, had a history of peaceful confederation for hundreds of years before the United States of America was actually created. And there's some evidence that Constitution, American so-called founding fathers might have been inspired by it. And so therefore, without global hegemony, you can have development of order in different contexts. You can call it regionally or in a pluralistic way. Now, the best example I can give you about how you can maintain a pluralistic order without having a hegemon is the Indian Ocean. Indian Ocean trade before the 16th century, when the Portuguese had arrived late 15th century, and then the Dutch and the British, then they changed the pattern. But before that, Indian Ocean was what do you call a mare liberum. Free trade, anybody can trade, and as long as you paid customs duties, and trade was managed not by sultans or king or maharajas. I've written an article in Foreign Policy magazine on this recently, but it was managed by small port city states. So Malindi, Mombasa, Mogadishu, Hormuz, Aden, Calicut, going all the way to Maliputam in the east coast of India to Malacca. The big empires of India, like Mughal Empire, did not interfere with that. There were no big empire in the Indian Ocean. So you could have economic openness and free trade without a hegemon. And another example I like to give is the cooperation among great powers. When great powers balance each other, no hegemony. So you think multipolar systems are necessarily bad. They have not always been unstable. So in Europe, we have the concert of Europe after the defeat of Napoleon. So when Britain, France, restored France and Russia and Austria-Hungary maintained stability. But in the ancient Near East, we had 5 great powers maintained peace like that for 500 years, maybe at least 200 years, and maybe 500 years. The Egypt, Hatti and Mitanni and Assyria and Babylon. So we have examples of multipolar systems or without non-hegemonic systems maintaining stability in the past. So one thing we can do is to say that we cannot be axiomatic that the end of American dominance, like single hegemon, or a multipolar system, which some people predict is emerging, is necessarily going to lead to chaos. And that's the beauty of history. You can find many different examples of multiple different ways in which all world order can be managed. And when we see the people in the United States or London worry about the US, not the decline of the US per se, I make a difference between decline of the United States as a power and the decline and end of the American-led world order. And I'm concerned about, I'm writing mostly about the second. Whether America is declining or not, the jury is still out as a power. But there is no question that American world order is declined, and I was one of the first people in my previous books to flag this. Now, will that lead to chaos? Not necessarily. We are basically doing a self-fulfilling prophecy here, that we are accepting what has been the case in the last, since 1945, as the long rule of history, the law of history, that you need a hegemon to maintain a global hegemon to maintain order. There is no such evidence from history.
Interesting. when you mentioned the example of the Indian Ocean trading system, which is really fascinating to see how these norms emerge, how stable it was. You point out, though, that it doesn't appear that there was any power that at the time had the capacity to be able to wage warfare across the sea in a manner in which they could establish hegemony over the sea. But once the Portuguese entered into the scene, they disrupted this system. What does that tell us, though, about the stability, the sustainability of this type of a system in the global context of today, in which there are not that many spaces similar to the Indian Ocean, in the sense that no one has the capacity of being able to establish dominance?
Well, no single country may have capacity. You might say that, look, the United States under the Trump too is actively undermining or destroying the WTO rules of reciprocity and based on rules-based, trade. But nobody is following the United States in imposing reciprocal tariffs. I mean, Trump has been asking the European Union to punish India, but they haven't done that. So far, other countries have not followed Trump in disrupting trade or disrupting multilateralism in the same way. And what it tells me is that other countries, the constituency for global order or world order is much larger than just the United States. The United States cannot destroy world order because it did not create it. It played a role, but the United States actually has been kind of in many ways, an absentee in some of the biggest institutions and laws we have today, like law of the sea. The United States has not ratified it. International Criminal Code, the United States hasn't signed it. Paris Climate Treaty, it played a role in developing it, but have withdrawn it. So other countries have withheld, not because it's in their interest. So trade is in their interest. So that you can talk about East Asia. So there is this regional comprehensive economic partnership, one of the largest trade arrangements in the world. And in fact, if you look carefully, it will exceed the European Union's free trade. So this was signed and now ratified, even when Trump was the first Trump administration. So they are maintaining that kind of trade openness because that has been the historical norm. And the Europeans, after Portuguese and then the Dutch, they fought with each other. And in my book, I describe how the Dutch-Portuguese conflict in Indian Ocean led to the death of the freedom of the seas because the Portuguese wouldn't allow the Dutch to trade, and the Dutch attacked the Portuguese militarily, and they looted a Portuguese ship off Singapore in 1603 and looted and sold the items in Europe, in Amsterdam or Rotterdam, and it went to adjudication, and the Dutch hired Hugo Grotius, a guy who is very well known as the founder of the freedom of seas, Mare Liberum. But actually, Grotius didn't get the idea out of the blue. The Portuguese provided, so the Dutch provided him with documents of the Indian Ocean trade, which was open and in that sense free. But he gets all the credit. But the irony is that the same East India Company, Dutch East India Company, VOC, who hired Hugo Grotius, ended up establishing a bigger monopoly than the Portuguese. They forced local rulers to trade with them first rather than trade with each other. So the Sultan of Makassar, which was now in Indonesia, one of the sultanates in the spice route, he told the Dutch that God created land and the sea. The land he gave to men, the sea he left in open. It has never been heard that anybody could prevent people, humans, from selling the seas. So the idea of global commons comes from there. Similarly, the Native American societies left the environment open. So it was a global common rather than they used it, they exploited it for their livelihood, but they did not claim it in the way the European settlers that came to North America basically developed their property rights by stealing their land and putting up fences. So we actually have long precedents of openness in trade, in ownership of property from other civilizations. And that has not required a hegemon, that has required willing states or societies, or tribes, you may call them, because it is another way, maybe a better way of creating stability and order, rather than putting up fences or creating rules like the Europeans. Basically, the Portuguese, after coming to Indian Ocean, developed a what do you call a mafia system? You pay us and you can trade, otherwise you cannot trade.
So, and what would you say then the world as a whole, and perhaps particularly the global South, can learn from this? Because we are now in an era in which we're seeing far greater agency coming, not just from multipoles, but even smaller states. Part of the reason I think you prefer the term a multiplex, because it's not just about the poles any longer. What are the lessons that can be learned in the sense of we're moving towards a system that at the end of the day will likely have two major powers at the top of the system, but power will nevertheless be much more dispersed than it was during the post-Cold War years. What are the things that can be taken from this history in order to make sure that the system is more stable going forward?
So the term Global South, like the term West, are very new constructs. I mean, earlier on, you asked me about the West. I mean, when did the term West come about? I mean, it's only last 100 years or so, and especially during the Cold War. Similarly, the Global South comes as a reaction against the West, or the Global North. And to me, both terms are kind of artificial constructs. But I also argue that it will be good to get rid of this binary, this dichotomy, because the similarities between the West and the rest, so-called, are more than what we realize. But then going back to the point of the rise of the global, there is no question that many of the countries of global South were big, great powers in the past, like China and India. If you include China in the global South or not, but certainly you will include India, Indonesia, they were major players in the past. And so it is only natural that they will recover some of the lost ground that they have lost in the last 300 years. And what they should learn from this, first of all, don't accept Western dominance as a fact of life, as a kind of a fate. Because one of the problems, one of the biggest damages colonialism did to the global South leaders, or the leaders in the countries that we count as global South, is to destroy their self-confidence, that made them feel like they're dependent, they cannot do anything on their own. The racist ideas of the rise of the West, coming from even philosophers like Kant and Hegel, denied agency to the countries that are now part of the global South. And the first thing global South will do is to recover his history and say that, and realize and recognize that it has agency. And that agency means being confident, not thinking in a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy ways that we have to depend on the West, otherwise we are doomed. That's the psychological cognitive shift. Then the other thing they should learn is that there are technologies, there are ideas, but most importantly, ways of organizing world order that are out there, which have been obscured by centuries of global Western dominance. The West doesn't recognize it out of ignorance or prejudice, and other countries, so-called rest, doesn't recognize it because they have been used to thinking, they've been schooled in curriculum textbooks that the West invented all this. I think you should rethink our history, and my book ends with a chapter that contains a lot of discussion about how do we challenge this, diffidence, how to challenge the gap in our knowledge, where most of the textbooks that we use in high schools and colleges tell us that the West invented everything and the rest just a follower. And my book counters that with empirical evidence, going back to 5,000 years, covering every civilization in the world. And so that kind of I think the knowledge production is one of the most critical areas in which Global South can take action.
Yeah, your book also makes the case that this is not just going to be a more fair and equitable system going forward, or the potential for it, for the vantage point or for the benefit of the so-called global South. You're making an argument that it could be better for everyone. So put yourselves in the shoes of the United States. We have a question from Farouk Ahmad, who says, as a practical matter, why would Americans consent to give up the fruits of power without a fight? Let me turn that question around a little bit and say, what is the benefit, or what do you see as the national interest in the United States that actually would put it into a better situation as this process continues, compared to what we have today or at least what we had in the past with that type of American dominance? Why is this multiplex or multipolar world good for the US as well?
That's a great question. And I have been asked this before. And the way I would address this question, I mean, of course, once you are sitting pretty in as a #1 country in the world, why should you give up your privilege? But my answer is that it may not be your choice anymore. That is not, the privilege is not for you. The privilege is wrong in the first place, and it may not be for you to give up. Other countries will claim it. So it may well be that the United States is not declining, but others are rising. If you want to avoid instability, this kind of inequality and hierarchy creates conflicts, and that affects the United States directly, but also indirectly through migration and through environmental damage that affects all of us. So my sense is that first of all, there is always going to be an ideological divide. There will be ideologues who want to preserve American dominance at all costs and want to make America great again or keep America great again. But there are also people who recognize that if you don't do this, if you hold on to this privilege for too long, there will be revolt. There will be instability, and you will be challenged. And so I agree that if the implication was that the West will not give up without a fight, that's true. That's what we see happening, especially under the American leadership. And by the way, in the United States, I haven't seen a lot of people, intellectuals, think tanks that actually accept America as #2. I have this formulation that Democrat or Republican, America should always be #1. It kind of rhymes. But I think in the long term, people are going to wake up. And it's the current world order, which has been dominated by the US. US has done pretty well since World War II. In fact, the American share of the global GDP is 27%, slightly higher than it was a few years ago. And technologically, US is the leading power. And the United States is actually, in some ways, it's a more privileged when it comes to services, rather than, we are focusing on manufacturing trade and services trade. The US is a net exporter. The US has benefited, but I think if it doesn't share the benefit, it will have problems, but especially other countries will come and challenge it. They will develop, hegemonies are trying to be a hegemony is always resisted. So that's actually causes instability. So the world order is actually one of the reasons why we have so many wars and interventions. And I don't have to tell you, the liberal orders in 1945 has not been very peaceful for most countries in the world. It's because of this hierarchy and the inequality. And inequality is even rising in the West. So you want to address these long-term issues, you need to change things. You may not want to give up, but you may not have a choice on this.
And I think it's also fair to point out, of course, that when you hear what the American people want, even though they may not be thinking in terms of global hegemony, etc., they clearly are turning against the expressions of that hegemony, which is all of these endless wars. It is having 750 bases around the world. It is to be constantly overextended, constantly being dragged into all kinds of different wars throughout the world without knowing exactly why is that of a vital interest for their own security. But the alternative to it is still a bit of a mystery in the minds of most people, and that mystery translates into anxiety and fear. You mentioned, though, you prefer the term multiplex rather than multipolar because you want to go outside of just thinking about power. You want to think about values, etc. But then at the same time, you're kind of agnostic about the contents of the different orders in the sense of are they pursuing, are these democratic states that as a result produce a more liberal order, etc. We have a question that is kind of related to this from Imran al-Badawi. Pre-modern governance relied heavily on the absolute justice of the monarch, which despite its shortcoming was incredibly stable. Modern Western governance relies on an increasingly problematic idea of democracy, while social justice and inequality are now running rampant. What is your view, he asks, about recentering the importance of justice instead of democracy in governance today? And I assume this is mostly from happening inside of the West. But I want to tack on a question onto that afterwards. Go ahead.
Sure. Let me just start by talking about anxiety. In fact, you'll find that the anxiety about the decline of Western dominance causing harm or creating mayhem is actually mostly found in the West. It's not as pronounced in the rest. I mean, the opinion polls confirm that there is much more optimism about the future in the non-Western countries, in countries like China, India, about world order than in London or Washington or Berlin, because West is, fearing the loss of its privileged position. I use the term multiplex rather than multipolar because multipolar is basically a great power club. A handful of great powers decide. It's like the great powers before of the 19th century, before World War II. Multiplex brings in regional actors, other actors, non-state actors, middle powers, and also talks about influence, not power. Power not on the basis of economic GDP or military power, but influence, soft power, normative power, and the like. And I think world order is more than just the distribution of power. And that's also, multiplex gives more space to regionalized creation of order. So it's a much broader concept. Now, the question about democracy and justice, in a normative sense, nobody can question that we should have democracy and justice, and but democracy in a formal sense without social justice and equality, in particular equality. I mean, United States is a democracy in some, but it has a lot, inequality is growing. Democracy and equality, social justice do not go hand in hand. And this is why one of the lessons of history, I hate to say this, that democracy has not been a very successful institution in the world. In fact, if you look at the history, 5,000 years of history, the republic and the idea of republic, even monarchy and empire have been more successful than democracy. But republics too, independent republics without. So I think we should not accept that democracy is the solution to every problem. It would be nice if it is like that. But we have to therefore accept that in the future world order, there will be a variety of political systems. I mean, what Francis Fukuyama said, end of history, democracy and capitalism prevailing over everybody else is, of course, completely wrong. And we can actually say that the world order will accommodate a variety of political systems. Some will be democracy, some will be dictatorship. Some will be in between, a lot of gray areas, social democracy, where justice is given more emphasis, like some of the European countries have it. Communitarianism is like more collective systems, like what you may have in China. They can lead to authoritarianism, but I think there's a difference between communitarian and authoritarian in terms of how decisions are made. And you could also have extremist states who are espousing extremist ideology. So I think accepting the diversity of political systems, but seeking, I think ultimately social justice and equality. To me, the equality is the biggest issue. And I can tell you some countries which are democratic, where there is very little equality, and some countries where democracy is at a deficit, which are maybe leaning authoritarian, but have provided stability and equality. So let's move away from focusing on democracy and focusing more on equality and justice. And that's what justice, by the way, is not a Western invention. There are all kinds of justice in the ancient world, and in China, in Sumerian, the Code of Hammurabi, to the Charter of Mali, the Mandan Charter of Mali. So I have written an article in Ethics and International Affairs on this, the once and future global ethics. And I would think we should not be obsessed with formal democracy. We should be obsessed with equality and substantive democracy.
But you do also reject then, I assume, the idea that only democracies can produce the type of an order in which the content of it, the norms that it encompasses, are what we would value highly. I mean, you point out that in India and Ashoka, for instance, the norms around the use of force were extremely progressive, but obviously produced by a non-democracy. So taking it out of what it will produce inside the countries, for the global system itself, you don't see a clear connection between the order being led by democracies and whether that order will necessarily have what we would call a liberal content.
So repeating slightly what I said earlier, what we know as democracy, a liberal democracy, is actually very much a late 19th century, early 20th century creation. So the ancient Athens was not democratic in the way we talk about it today. And democracy has a very checkered history, non-linear history. But still, there was justice in many parts of the world. The principles of justice, including humanitarian norms we have today, came from places which are not necessarily democratic. I'll give you an example from India. You mentioned King Ashoka, which is very close to where I grew up in India. He fought a war with my ancient state called Kalinga in around 260 BC. He killed 100,000 people, took 150,000 prisoners, and then he renounced war completely. And he created one of the most just systems of governance known in history. Okay, but at the same time, he did not give up he did not create a democracy, right? So he remained a universal emperor, monarch. Alexander the Great, who was tutored by Aristotle, his tutor was Aristotle, and I mentioned that in the book. When Alexander conquered Persia and Egypt, he didn't create democracy. He actually anointed himself as the great king of Persia and the pharaoh of Egypt. But he also had some of his ideas for creating a universal order between, say, the Persians and the Greeks was actually ahead of its time, and in some ways spoke to the idea of equality and justice among nations. So I don't think democracy has a monopoly on justice. It will be nice, as maybe Winston Churchill said this, democracy is a terrible form of government except all others. I particularly think democracy will be great. I have always defended democracy in my writing, but I am also not convinced that this is the only way you can provide for the welfare and security and justice for the people. And that's a lesson in history where democracy has been minority, a very minor form of government in the long span of history.
Very interesting. I want to take it back to some of the questions about power in this equation. We have a question from my colleague here at the Quincy Institute, Artinder Simonian, who is asking why are forms of order prior to the advent of modern state system relevant today? Because aren't these former models in fact irrelevant since power could not project military force in the same way as they can do today, since they were much more isolated? I mean, of course, some of these systems could sustain order for a longer period of time because there just wasn't enough power to be able to conduct warfare in the same manner that can be done today. And then add to that the latest technology with AI, etc. It raises the question, are we perhaps in a completely different type of an environment today in which, again, examples of multiplex and multipolarity in the past may not be fully relevant for today? Or is it the other way around?
Okay, I'll answer it briefly and broadly. One is that I don't claim that history repeats itself. I don't think examples from the past are necessarily going to be effective in the present, but they can be adapted to the present. Just as we were able to adapt democracy from ancient Athens to the 20th century America, let's say, or West, we have to adapt these ideas. But I don't think you can also say history is totally irrelevant, because when you find examples of a peace treaty between two countries that replicates or the UN non-aggression principles, when you find a great power cooperation in the ancient Near East, which maintained peace for hundreds of years, whereas the European concert system in the 19th century collapsed after less than 100, you have to say that some of these principles are durable. They have to be adapted. They have to be localized to different contexts, but they're out there, and we should not therefore totally say, oh, these have no relevance. I think there is a lot of relevance to great power cooperation, the past model, freedom of the seas from the Indian Ocean today, because it also tells you. I wrote an article in New York Times the day the book was launched, published, and I basically argued that the idea is not that history repeats itself, but history provides examples and models of pathways, alternative, different, wider range of pathways of how you can solve contemporary problems. And that applies to not only security and free trade, but also to environmental protection. I think you can learn a lot from native societies. And the reason I'm saying this is because some of this knowledge is either lost or not emphasized. I mean, I in some ways target my book to a younger generation. When they read about world order, they read like Henry Kissinger's book, and they find that Africa is never mentioned. And colonialism is not mentioned. Native American societies are not mentioned, as if these don't exist. When you read Neil Ferguson's book, Civilization, he says West invented everything within a small area of Europe. And this completely marginalizes the other societies. And that's not historically also a fact. So I think the idea is to empower the thinking of current leaders in the global South, and that they have done this, they can do it, but they cannot just reinvent history or abuse history some ways. History is being abused by regimes who want to maintain their position in many countries in the global South. But that's not the point. The point is history can be also used to challenge authoritarianism. You'll find that history can be used to entrench for and against authoritarianism. And I think history will help us to give us more ideas, more sense of the wider world order, wider creation of world order from multiple societies. And one final point here is that it develops mutual respect. When I offer these lessons to my students in a multicultural setting, many of my students would not know this. And they express, oh, really? And these are students from the West. They grew up in the East Coast of the United States, and they never taught this, like the idea that there was freedom of seas in the Indian Ocean, or there was a post-peace treaty was between the Egyptians and Hittites. But what happens is that their respect for the cultures and civilizations of what we call the global South, increases. And similarly, it creates this better understanding, mutual respect. And that is actually the best antidote to the clash of civilization. And only policymakers can also get this idea that you cannot simply have a lot of the discourse we have in diplomacy is where Western countries dismiss the contribution of non-Western countries. And I can tell you many examples during the creation of the United Nations and the like. But if you know that, no civilization is perfectly peaceful. All civilizations have dark aspects, and they're attractive and ugly at the same time. But we cannot say only the West is attractive and progressive, and the rest is ugly or has no agency, no contribution. And that's the kind of discourse I want to develop vis-a-vis the standard work of people like Kissinger, Ferguson, and others. I'm not saying we should read that, but I'm saying that this is the alternative narrative of world order. Give it some thought. You don't have to agree with it, but this gives you a different view, and maybe we can find some common ground.
Thank you so much. We're quickly running out of time. This hour went very fast, but I do have one more question, which is your book gives excellent examples of many successes of non-Western ordering civilization ideas that have come to shape our world today. But what about things that we can learn from their failures? What are the breakdowns of non-Western orders that also gives us very valuable, instructive lessons for today and what we should be thinking about as we are now transitioning away from one system to something else that has not yet been defined? What can we learn from the failures?
Well, the first thing I would say, don't take the current world order as permanent. So world orders rise and fall, just like nations and empires rise and fall. So what we have in the last, say, 80 years, 1945, is not necessarily the way of the world. Be prepared for change and don't fear change. So there is a great fear of the past, the great fear of a revival of non-Western powers, and what you call the fear of the rest. And I think Western countries should avoid that fear. Don't turn it into a self-fulfilling prophecy. And look at the facts and histories. Don't go by the sort of versions of history that are out there in a very superficial way. I am not going to blame the media per se. I think media is to be blamed. Now, there are a lot of good history in the media too. So you have to be, you have to get a source. And this book is supposed to provide a one-stop source for this kind of alternative history. Another thing I would say is that get rid of the West versus the rest. And that's my really, the last paragraph of my book talks about the West is an artificial construct. The rest is a reaction to the West. And the West versus the rest has caused a lot of harm, a lot of conflict in the world. Ultimately, empirically, you can find that many good ideas came from the West and many good ideas came from the rest. But the whole category is a
I think we may have lost you, Professor. Let's see if we could give it another second. All right. It seems like we may have lost the professor. Thankfully, there was very little time left, so perhaps the damage is less than what it could have been had it happened mid-hour. So let me, even though he may not be able to hear me, let me thank you, Professor. This was a fantastic conversation. I strongly recommend everyone to read the book. It is very thought-provocative. It provides a tremendous amount of historical depth of things that I think most of us who are studying political science, international relations, are quite unaware of, because so much of the focus of that literature has been on Western sources and Western examples. And there's plenty, of course, to learn from the rest of the world. I want to also make sure I give a bit of a plug for our next event, which will happen tomorrow at the same time, 12 p.m. Eastern Time. It will be a conversation with Branko Milanovic, one of the world's leading scholars of economic inequality, on his new book, The Great Global Transformation, the United States, China, and the Remaking of the World Economic Order. That book talk will be conducted by our Director of Studies, Marcus Stanley. For those of you who are not subscribed to the Quincy Institute's mailing list, please go to www.quincyinst.org, sign up for the mailing list so that you automatically get invitations to all of our events, all of our panels, webinars, as well as receive our reports and op-eds, etc. Thank you again for joining us, and hope to see you tomorrow. Thank you so much.